welcome to Mail Story. If you enjoy stories, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next ones.
My ex-husband served me at my mother's funeral and took everything, including my inherited house. So I bought back everything with his own inheritance. My ex-husband Ronald spent 2 years secretly planning our divorce with his lawyer friend Barry, while I thought we were working on our marriage through counseling that he insisted we needed because I was too emotional and difficult to live with. Ronald had moved assets, hidden bank accounts, and transferred property titles, all while holding my hand at therapy and promising we'd get through this rough patch together. When he finally filed, I was served at my mother's funeral while giving her eulogy, because Ronald said emotional distress would make me easier to negotiate with. His lawyer had crafted an airtight case showing I was mentally unstable based on therapy notes Ronald had secretly recorded, financially irresponsible based on purchases he'd made in my name without telling me, and an unfit mother based on photos he'd taken of the house when I had the flu and couldn't clean. The judge gave Ronald everything, including the house I'd inherited from my grandmother, my car that I'd paid for before marriage, my retirement account that he'd convinced me to put in both names for tax reasons, and worst of all, primary custody of our daughter Zoe, who was 7, and didn't understand why mommy only saw her every other weekend now. Ronald even got my engagement ring back, claiming it was a family heirloom when he'd bought it at a pawn shop. He took my grandmother's china, my book collection, my mother's jewelry that he gave to his new girlfriend Bethany, who was 22, and thought Ronald was a successful businessman, not a thief who'd stolen everything from his wife. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment and started over with nothing, while Ronald lived in my grandmother's house with Bethany, who posted photos wearing my mother's necklace. Ronald would drop Zoe off and make comments about how sad it was that I'd lost everything through my own incompetence. He'd tell Zoe that mommy couldn't afford nice things because mommy wasn't smart with money like daddy. He'd send me bills for half of Zoe's expenses, even though he'd taken all our assets, and I was working 2 jobs just to pay rent. His mother, Francine, would call to gloat about how Ronald had finally gotten free from me and found a woman who deserved him. She'd say I should be grateful Ronald even let me see Zoe, considering what a mess I'd become. The thing about Francine was she was 83 and worth about $4 million from her husband's life insurance and smart investments she'd made over 40 years. She'd always promised Ronald he'd inherit everything as her only child, and he was counting on that money to retire early. Francine had mild dementia that came and went, but was mostly sharp and lived alone, refusing to go to assisted living. Ronald checked on her once a month to make sure she was still alive and his inheritance was secure. That's when I started visiting Francine every day. I brought her groceries and cooked her meals and cleaned her house and listened to her stories about the past. I took her to doctor appointments and picked up prescriptions and made sure she took her medications. I became the daughter she'd never had while Ronald was too busy with Bethany to notice his mother needed help. Francine started calling me her angel and saying I was the only person who really cared about her. After 6 months of daily visits, Francine asked me to help her with some paperwork. She was confused about her will and wanted to make sure everything was in order. I helped her contact a lawyer to review everything and make sure her wishes were clear. The lawyer met with Francine alone multiple times to ensure she wasn't being influenced. Francine was completely lucid during these meetings and very clear about what she wanted. She said Ronald had shown his true character by stealing from his wife and child, and she couldn't leave money to someone so cruel. She said I'd shown more love in 6 months than Ronald had in 50 years. She changed her will, leaving everything to me and Zoe in a trust that Ronald couldn't touch. She also added a note explaining exactly why Ronald was disinherited, including his treatment of me and his neglect of her. 8 months later, Francine passed peacefully with me holding her hand while Ronald was in Hawaii, with Bethany spending money he thought he'd inherit soon. He didn't even come back for 3 days, claiming flights were expensive. At the will reading, Ronald showed up in a new suit, already planning how to spend his millions. The lawyer read Francine's will, stating that everything went to me as Zoe's trustee, and Ronald got nothing. Ralph's face stays completely blank as he continues reading, his voice steady and professional like he's done this 1,000 times before. The entire $4 million estate passes to me as trustee for Zoe's benefit. Every single penny that Ronald counted on for his early retirement and fancy lifestyle with Bethany. Ralph pulls out a second document, this one handwritten on Francine's personal stationery, and he reads it aloud without any emotion, even though the words are cutting Ronald into pieces. Francine wrote that her son showed his true character by stealing from his wife and child, that he spent 2 years planning to destroy the mother of his grandchild while pretending to work on their marriage, that he took everything, including a house his wife inherited from her grandmother. She wrote about how Ronald visited her once a month just to make sure she was still alive, and his money was safe, how he never called to check if she needed anything, how he went to Hawaii while she was dying because flights back were too expensive. She wrote about how I came every single day for 8 months, brought groceries and cooked meals and listened to her stories, took her to doctor appointments, and made sure she took her medications, became the daughter she never had while her real son was too busy with his 22-year-old girlfriend to notice his mother needed help. Ronald jumps out of his chair so fast it falls backward and crashes against the wall behind him. He's screaming that this is fraud, that I manipulated his confused mother who had dementia, that he's going to sue me for everything and prove I'm a liar and a thief. His face is bright red and spit flies from his mouth as he yells, and Barry puts a hand on his arm trying to calm him down, but Ronald shakes him off. Ralph stays completely calm and sets down the letter, then picks up another folder from his desk. He explains in that same steady voice that Mio Chin conducted multiple competency evaluations over a 6-week period, that Francine was completely lucid during every single meeting, that there are video recordings of her explaining her reasoning in her own words. He says Francine met with 2 different doctors who confirmed she understood exactly what she was doing, that she wrote the letter herself without anyone helping or suggesting what to say, that every possible legal protection was put in place specifically because they knew Ronald would challenge this. Barry's face goes pale as Ralph talks, and I can see him doing math in his head about the legal bills this is going to create, and how Ronald definitely can't pay them now. Barry clearly expected his friend to inherit millions, and was probably already planning how much he could charge for managing the estate, and now he's realizing that all the careful legal work went into making sure he couldn't challenge anything successfully. I sit in my chair with my hands folded in my lap, while Ronald paces back and forth still yelling, and I feel this weird mix of feelings I wasn't expecting. Part of me wants to smile because this is exactly what I planned for. Exactly what Ronald deserves after what he did to me and Zoe. But another part feels genuinely sad that Francine is dead. That this woman who became my friend is gone, and I'll never hear her stories again, or see her face light up when I brought her favorite cookies. The money feels almost beside the point compared to the fact that Francine saw through her son completely, understood what kind of person he really was, and chose to protect the grandchild he used as a weapon against me. She could have split the money between us or given Ronald something small, but she chose to give him absolutely nothing because that's what she thought he deserved. Ronald is still yelling about lawyers and challenges and how he's going to prove I'm a criminal, but Ralph just keeps sitting there calmly with all his folders and documents, and I know Ronald already lost this fight before it even started. Ralph waits until Ronald finally runs out of steam and collapses back into his chair, breathing hard. Then he reaches into his desk and pulls out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Francine's shaky handwriting. He hands it across the desk to me and says Francine left this specifically for me with instructions that I should read it privately. I take the envelope and hold it carefully, feeling the weight of the paper and seeing how Francine's writing got wobbly near the end when her hands weren't working as well. Ralph explains that there are more legal documents I need to sign, but they can wait until next week, and he suggests that Ronald might want to consult with his own attorney before taking any actions he'll regret. Barry nods quickly and starts gathering his papers, clearly ready to get Ronald out of there before he makes things worse. I stand up and thank Ralph for his time, and I walk out of that office with the envelope pressed against my chest while Ronald's voice follows me down the hallway, still yelling about fraud and manipulation. I sit in my car in the parking garage for 10 minutes before I can make myself open the envelope, just holding it and thinking about Francine and how she must have known she was dying when she wrote this. My hands shake a little as I tear open the seal and pull out 2 pages of that same shaky handwriting, and I have to blink hard a few times because my eyes are getting blurry. Francine thanks me for treating her with dignity and love when her own son couldn't be bothered to visit more than once a month. She writes that she knows I started coming to see her because I was angry at Ronald and looking for any advantage I could find, and she's not stupid enough to think my motives were pure at the beginning. But she says I grew to genuinely care about her over those 8 months, that she could tell the difference between someone pretending and someone who actually gave a damn, and that makes me a better person than Ronald ever was or ever will be. She writes that Ronald showed her who he really was when he stole everything from his wife and child, when he served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral because he thought it would make me easier to manipulate. She says she can't leave her money to someone that cruel, someone who would destroy the mother of his own daughter just to feel powerful and in control. The letter ends with her saying she hopes the money helps me build a good life for Zoe, and she's sorry she didn't see Ronald's true character sooner, so she could have helped me during the divorce. I drive to my apartment with the letter on the passenger seat, and halfway there I have to pull over because I'm crying too hard to see the road. I sit in a random parking lot and let myself feel everything at once. The grief over losing Francine, and the satisfaction of beating Ronald, and the guilt about how this all started. When I finally get home, I call Oswald Ramey, the attorney I hired 2 weeks ago when I knew the will reading was coming up soon. He answers on the second ring and asks how it went, and I tell him everything Ralph said about the competency evaluations and the video recordings and the multiple doctors. Oswald makes satisfied sounds and says he already reviewed all the will documents I sent him last week, that Francine's lawyers built protections so strong that Ronald's challenges are basically worthless before they even start. He explains that we should expect threats and legal letters and maybe even a formal lawsuit, but none of it will go anywhere because Francine documented everything perfectly. He says the inheritance will be in probate for a few months while everything gets processed, but there's no real chance Ronald can touch any of it. That evening, my phone starts ringing over and over, and I let it go to voicemail the first 16 times because I know it's Ronald, and I'm not ready to hear his voice yet. On the 17th call, I finally answer, because I know he won't stop until I do. And immediately he's yelling, and then begging, and then threatening, and then begging again. He says I manipulated his sick mother and stole his inheritance and ruined his life. And then 2 seconds later, he's asking me to please do the right thing and share the money because we were married for 10 years, and that should count for something. I wait until he stops talking, and then I say very calmly that Francine made her choice based on his own actions, based on how he treated me and Zoe and his own mother for years. I tell him I'm honoring her wishes by making sure Zoe's future is secure from his financial games and manipulation. He starts yelling again about how I'm a thief and a liar, so I hang up and block his number on everything except the co-parenting app we use for Zoe's schedule. The next morning, I wake up to find a certified letter slipped under my apartment door, and I know what it is before I even open it. Barry sent a formal legal threat about undue influence and elder abuse, claiming I manipulated a confused old woman and isolated her from her loving son. The letter demands that I voluntarily disclaim the inheritance and allow it to pass to Ronald as Francine's natural heir, and it threatens criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits if I don't comply within 10 business days. I take photos of every page and email them to Oswald, then I go make coffee and wait for him to call back. He calls 20 minutes later and he's actually laughing, like genuinely cracking up about how stupid this letter is. He explains that these exact challenges were anticipated and prepared for, that Francine's documentation of her reasoning and mental state makes these threats completely empty. He says Barry is probably doing this because Ronald is pressuring him and he needs to show he tried something, but any lawyer who actually reads the case file will tell Ronald he's wasting his time and money. I go to work at both my jobs like always, because the inheritance is still in probate and I still need to pay rent and buy groceries and keep my life running. But there's this lightness in my chest that wasn't there before. This feeling that Zoe's future is protected now no matter what Ronald tries to do. My coworkers notice I'm smiling more and humming while I work, and a few of them ask if something good happened. I just tell them I got some positive news about a family matter and leave it at that, because I'm not ready to explain the whole complicated story of how I got my ex-husband's inheritance by taking care of his mother while he ignored her. 3 days after the will reading, someone knocks on my apartment door in the middle of the afternoon on my day off. I look through the peephole and see Bethany standing there wearing my mother's necklace, the one Ronald gave her after he stole it from me in the divorce. She's dressed up like she's going somewhere nice and her makeup is perfect and she looks nervous. I open the door but don't invite her in, just stand there waiting to see what she wants. She starts talking really fast about how Ronald is devastated and not sleeping and barely eating, about how he really loved his mother, and he's heartbroken that I turned her against him. She says I look at that necklace hanging around her neck, the one my mother wore every day until she died, and I feel completely calm. I tell Bethany she's welcome to keep the stolen jewelry since it suits her perfectly, and I suggest she start looking for someone with actual money to date since Ronald's inheritance just disappeared. Her face goes red and she opens her mouth to say something, but I close the door before she can get the words out. Zoe's custody visit happens that weekend, and when Ronald drops her off, he won't even look at me, just lets her out of the car and drives away fast. Zoe seems confused and quiet, and after we eat dinner, she asks me why Daddy seems so angry all the time now. I think carefully about how to explain this in a way that's honest but appropriate for a 7-year-old, and I tell her that Grandma Francine left her a special gift to help with her future. I explain that sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings about money, and Daddy is upset because he thought he would get Grandma's money, but she chose to give it to Zoe instead. I tell her that none of this changes how much both her parents love her, and the money is just to make sure she can go to college and have a good life. Zoe thinks about this for a minute, and then asks if that means we can get a bigger apartment with a room just for her, and I tell her maybe someday soon when everything is finished with the lawyers. I check my phone the next morning and see Ronald's Facebook post has blown up overnight. He's written this long thing about losing his beloved mother and how his greedy ex-wife manipulated a confused elderly woman into changing her will. The comments start out sympathetic with people saying they're sorry for his loss and how terrible I am, but then I see Francine's neighbor, Mrs. Smith, has commented. She writes that she lives next door to Francine's house and never saw Ronald visit more than once a month, but she saw me there every single day for 8 months, bringing groceries and taking Francine to appointments. Another neighbor jumps in saying the same thing, and then someone else posts actual photos from their phone, showing me helping Francine carry shopping bags up her front steps. The timestamps on the photos prove I was there consistently, while Ronald was nowhere to be found. I watch the comment section turn against Ronald in real time as more neighbors pile on with their own observations about how I was the only one who cared for Francine, while her son was ignored her. Someone asks why Ronald never visited his mother if he loved her so much, and Ronald starts deleting comments and blocking people, which just makes him look worse. I screenshot everything before he can erase it all, sending copies to Oswald, who says this kind of public documentation of Ronald's neglect could be useful if things get messy. 2 days later, Oswald calls to tell me Barry has filed a formal legal challenge claiming Francine lacked the mental capacity to change her will. I feel my stomach drop, because even though Oswald warned me this would probably happen, actually facing it feels different. The next 2 weeks are brutal, with depositions where Barry tries to paint Francine as confused, and me as a manipulator who took advantage. Mio shows up to every single deposition with boxes of documentation, and watching her work is like watching someone dismantle a bomb with perfect calm. She presents medical records from Francine's doctor, showing regular cognitive assessments that were all normal. She shows competency evaluations from 2 different specialists who examined Francine specifically to determine if she understood what she was doing with the will. She even has video recordings of Francine explaining her reasoning in clear, sharp language. Makes it obvious she knew exactly what she was choosing and why. Barry keeps pushing about Francine's dementia diagnosis, but Mio calmly explains that mild dementia doesn't mean someone lacks capacity for legal decisions. especially when they're having good days and multiple professionals have evaluated them as competent. I watch Ronald's face get redder as each piece of evidence makes his case look more desperate and vindictive. By the end of the second week, even Barry looks tired and defeated, like he knows he's fighting a losing battle, but has to keep going because Ronald won't accept reality. The worst deposition happens on day 9 when Barry questions me directly about why I started visiting Francine so suddenly after the divorce. I sit there in that conference room with the court reporter typing everything and Oswald beside me, and I decide to just tell the truth. I say I was angry after losing everything, and I was looking for any advantage I could find. I admit I started visiting Francine partly because I knew Ronald was counting on that inheritance, and I wanted to hurt him the way he'd hurt me. But then I explain how Francine became a real friend over those 8 months, how I genuinely cared about her and enjoyed her company and felt protective of her when I saw how alone she was. I say Francine made her own choices based on watching her son's character for 50 years, not just my 8 months of visits. I tell them about how she'd talk about Ronald as a child and how disappointed she was in the man he became, how she couldn't understand how someone could be so cruel to his own family. Barry tries to make me sound calculating and cold, but I just keep coming back to the fact that Francine was sharp and clear-minded when she changed her will, and she had very specific reasons that had nothing to do with me manipulating her. Oswald squeezes my arm when we leave that deposition, telling me I did well by being honest instead of trying to pretend my motives were pure from the start. The judge takes only 3 days to review everything and rule in my favor. Oswald calls me at work with the news, reading parts of the decision where the judge says Francine's documentation is extraordinary and her reasoning completely sound. The judge writes that Francine clearly understood her assets, her family situation, and the consequences of her choices, and that she articulated valid reasons for disinheriting her son based on his treatment of his family and his neglect of her care. Ronald is ordered to pay my legal fees for bringing a challenge that the judge calls frivolous and without merit. Oswald tells me the fees will be around $15,000, and he knows for a fact that Ronald doesn't have that kind of money sitting around. I feel this weird mix of relief and exhaustion, like I've been holding my breath for 2 weeks and can finally let it out. The inheritance is secure now, protected for Zoe's future, and Ronald's attempt to steal it back has failed just like it should have. I use some of the inheritance money that's released from probate to move into a bigger apartment. It's a 2-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood with a small yard where Zoe can play. I spend a weekend painting her room the light purple she's been wanting, setting up her bed and dresser and filling the closet with clothes that actually fit. It's not as nice as my grandmother's house that Ronald stole, but it's clean and safe, and it's ours. When Zoe sees her room for the first time, she runs around touching everything like she can't believe it's real. She asks if this means she can stay here more often, and I tell her we're working on that. I buy groceries to fill the fridge and pantry, simple things like cereal and juice boxes and sandwich stuff, but having a full kitchen again feels like luxury after 2 years of barely scraping by. I sit on my new couch that first night after Zoe falls asleep in her purple room, and I let myself feel something close to peace for the first time since my mother's funeral. Word spreads fast about Ronald's disinheritance and failed legal challenge, and apparently he'd been living way beyond his means, expecting Francine's money to bail him out. I hear through mutual friends that he's behind on the mortgage for my grandmother's house, and his credit cards are maxed out. 2 weeks after the judge's ruling, Bethany leaves him and moves in with some guy she met at a bar. My coworker shows me Bethany's Instagram, where she's already posting couple photos with her new boyfriend, who drives a nice car and takes her to expensive restaurants. She's still wearing my mother's necklace in the photos, though, which bothers me more than it probably should. Ronald's Facebook goes quiet after the neighbor comments destroyed his sympathy campaign, and I hear he's barely leaving the house except to go to work. Part of me feels satisfied watching his life fall apart the way mine did, but mostly I just feel tired of caring about his problems. I schedule a meeting with a family law mediator to talk about changing the custody arrangement. Now that I have a proper apartment and financial stability, there's no reason Zoe should only see me every other weekend. Oswald comes with me to the first meeting to discuss strategy, and he tells me something that surprises me. He says I should ask for equal custody, not primary custody, even though I could probably get it given Ronald's financial problems and the judge's comments about his character. Oswald explains that Zoe needs both parents, even if Ronald is a terrible ex-husband, and being vindictive won't help my daughter. He reminds me that I hated how Ronald used Zoe as a weapon against me, and doing the same thing back would make me just like him. I know he's right, even though part of me wants to take everything from Ronald, the way he took everything from me. The mediation session happens in a bland office with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. Ronald shows up looking tired and angry, sitting as far from me as possible while the mediator explains the process. When I propose equal custody with week-on, week-off switching, Ronald explodes. He accuses me of using money to steal his daughter the same way I stole his inheritance. He says I'm just doing this for revenge and I don't actually care about what's best for Zoe. The mediator, this calm older woman who's clearly seen every kind of custody fight, lets him rant for about 2 minutes before cutting him off. She points out very directly that I'm proposing equal custody, not trying to limit his time with Zoe the way he limited mine. She says my proposal shows considerably more maturity than his dramatic accusations, and maybe he should focus on what's actually best for his daughter instead of his own hurt feelings. Ronald's face goes red, but he shuts up, and I can see him struggling not to say something that would make him look even worse. Barry shows up late to the mediation, and he pulls Ronald aside for a private conversation in the hallway. Through the glass door, I can see Barry talking seriously, while Ronald shakes his head and gestures angrily. When they come back in, Barry quietly tells the mediator that his client is willing to accept the proposed custody modification. I watch Ronald's face while Barry talks, and I can see pure rage behind his eyes at being cornered into fairness. He's being forced to agree to equal custody because fighting it would cost money he doesn't have and make him look vindictive to any judge who might review the case. Barry makes him sign the agreement right there, probably worried that Ronald will change his mind if given time to think about it. The mediator witnesses the signatures and says she'll file everything with the court, and just like that, I have equal custody of my daughter again. Ronald walks out without saying a word to me, and I hear his car peel out of the parking lot. Zoe is confused when I explain the new custody schedule, but she's also clearly happy about spending more time with me. She asks why it's changing now, and I tell her simply that Mommy has a better place to live with a room just for her, so we can spend more time together. I'm very careful not to say anything bad about her father, even though I have years of material I could use. When she mentions that Daddy seems mad a lot lately, I just tell her that grown-ups sometimes have complicated feelings about changes, but both her parents love her very much. I focus on making our time together stable and loving, keeping routines that help her feel secure. We have breakfast together every morning during my weeks, and I help her with homework at the kitchen table, and we read books before bed in her purple room. She starts leaving toys and clothes at my apartment instead of packing everything each time, and I can see her relaxing into the idea that this is really her home too, not just a place she visits. I give my notice at the coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, and my manager looks surprised but happy for me. She says I've been one of her most reliable workers, even when she could tell I was exhausted, and she hopes things are getting better for me. I don't tell her about the inheritance or the custody change, just say that my situation has improved enough that I can focus on one job now. The extra time means I can volunteer for Zoe's school field trips and attend her parent-teacher conferences without having to beg for schedule changes or miss work hours I desperately needed. Her teacher pulls me aside after class one afternoon and mentions that Zoe seems much more settled lately, less anxious during lessons, and more willing to participate in group activities. She says whatever changes have happened at home are clearly helping, and Zoe talks about Mommy more positively now, instead of the sad, confused way she used to mention our limited time together. I feel something loosen in my chest hearing this, like maybe I'm actually undoing some of the damage Ronald created with his custody manipulation and constant comments about my failures. Zoe still has rough days where she's clearly processing the divorce and the changes, but she's sleeping better at my apartment and doesn't cry as much when Ronald picks her up anymore. I get an email from Ronald 3 weeks after the custody modification goes through, and it's a formal demand that I pay him child support now that I have access to Francine's money. He lists out expenses for Zoe and claims that since I'm now wealthy, I should be contributing more than half to her care. I forward the email to Oswald without even responding to Ronald directly, and Oswald calls me back within an hour laughing. He explains that the inheritance is in a trust for Zoe that I manage but can't access for personal use, and I'm still living on my regular salary from my one remaining job. Ronald has no legal grounds to demand child support from trust funds designated for our daughter's future, and the desperation in his attempt to grab any piece of Francine's money would be pathetic if it wasn't so predictable. Oswald sends Ronald a formal letter explaining the trust structure and warning him that further frivolous demands will result in documentation of harassment that could affect the custody arrangement we just established. Ronald doesn't respond to the letter, but I can imagine his rage at being shut down again, at watching money he thought was his remain completely out of his reach. A letter arrives in my mailbox with a return address I don't recognize, and when I open it, I find 3 pages of neat handwriting from someone named Margaret. She introduces herself as one of Francine's friends from their book club, and she writes that she wanted to thank me for the care I provided during Francine's final months. Margaret describes how Francine would talk about me during their meetings, mentioning my daily visits, and how I'd helped her with errands and appointments when her own son couldn't be bothered. She writes that Francine spoke about me with genuine affection, calling me the daughter she wished she'd had, and that several of the book club members had noticed how much happier Francine seemed once I started visiting regularly. Margaret says she attended the funeral and heard about the will, and she wants me to know that Francine knew exactly what she was doing when she made those changes. She writes that Francine talked about Ronald's treatment of me and Zoe, about how horrified she was to learn what her son had done, and that she felt at peace knowing the money would protect Zoe from Ronald's selfishness instead of rewarding his cruelty. I read the letter 3 times, crying by the end, because it confirms what I'd hoped but wasn't sure about. Francine's choice wasn't confusion or manipulation. It was clear-eyed justice from a woman who saw her son's true character and chose to protect her grandchild instead. 3 months after the will reading, I take Zoe to visit Francine's grave on a Saturday morning. We stop at a garden center first, and Zoe picks out pink and purple flowers, saying Grandma would like pretty colors. At the cemetery, we kneel in the grass beside the headstone, and I show Zoe how to dig small holes for the plants. She asks questions about Grandma while we work, and I tell her age-appropriate stories about Francine's sharp sense of humor and her love of mystery novels. Zoe pats dirt around the flowers carefully, then sits back and asks if Grandma was mad at Daddy. I choose my words carefully, explaining that sometimes people make choices about their money based on who they trust to use it wisely, and Grandma trusted that Mommy would make sure Zoe had everything she needed. I tell her that Grandma loved her very much and wanted her to have a good future, and that's why she made the choices she did. Zoe seems to accept this explanation, nodding seriously, then asks if we can visit Grandma again and bring different colored flowers next time. We stay for a while longer, Zoe talking to the headstone about school and her favorite books, and I feel grateful that my daughter has this connection to Francine, even though they didn't have much time together. I'm scrolling through real estate listings on my phone during my lunch break when I see it. My grandmother's house, the house Ronald stole from me in the divorce, listed for sale with professional photos showing rooms I used to know by heart. The price is reasonable for the neighborhood, and the listing mentions that the seller is motivated and looking for a quick close. I stare at the photos for a long time, seeing my grandmother's built-in bookshelves and the window seat where I used to read as a child, now staged with furniture that isn't mine. Ronald must be drowning financially without the inheritance he'd counted on, unable to afford the mortgage and maintenance on a house this size. I feel a complicated mix of satisfaction and something almost like sadness, watching him lose the thing he stole from me, even though I know I'm not getting it back, and some random buyer will end up with my family home. My phone rings 2 days later with a number I don't recognize, and when I answer, it's a real estate agent named Alice handling my grandmother's house sale. She says she noticed my last name matches the property records from before the recent ownership change, and she's wondering if I might be interested in making an offer since I have family history with the home. The irony hits me so hard I almost laugh, and I tell her I call Oswald immediately and explain the situation, and he's quiet for a moment before asking me a question I hadn't considered. He wants to know if I want the house itself, with all the memories and history attached, or if I just want the satisfaction of taking it back from Ronald. I don't have an answer right away, and Oswald tells me to think carefully about what will actually make me happy versus what will just feel like winning. He reminds me that the house will need work and upkeep, that moving Zoe again might be disruptive, and that I need to separate revenge from genuine desire for the property. I spend 3 days thinking about Oswald's question before I call Alice back and tell her I want to make an offer. But I'm clear with myself about why I'm doing this. It's not just revenge against Ronald, though that's definitely part of it. The house was my grandmother's, and before that, it was a place where I felt safe and loved as a child. I want Zoe to grow up in those rooms, to have the big backyard I remember, to build memories in a house that has good history beneath the layer of Ronald's brief occupation. I make an offer at fair market value, nothing vindictive or lowball, just a straightforward purchase at the asking price. Alice calls back within hours saying the seller has accepted, and we move toward closing quickly because Ronald clearly needs the money desperately. At the closing, Ronald sits across the table from me, signing papers with a pen that shakes slightly in his hand. I watch his face while the title transfers back to me, and I can see the exact moment he understands what's happening. He lost everything through his own cruelty, and now he's watching me buy back the house he stole using money from the inheritance he thought was his. He doesn't say a word to me during the entire closing, just signs where the lawyer points and walks out with a check that will barely cover his debts. Moving day happens on a warm Saturday, and Zoe bounces around the empty rooms asking which one will be hers. I let her pick from the 3 bedrooms upstairs, and she chooses the one with the window seat, the same room I had as a child. We spend weekends slowly removing all traces of Ronald and Bethany's presence, painting over their color choices and replacing the cheap fixtures they'd installed. I find small evidences of their time here, scratches on the hardwood floors, a crack in the bathroom tile, things that need repair. Zoe helps me paint her room purple, getting more paint on herself than the walls, and I'm careful to create new memories here, rather than dwelling on what was stolen. We plant flowers in the garden together, and I teach her how to use my grandmother's old gardening tools that I find in the shed. The house starts to feel like ours again instead of a crime scene, and Zoe's excitement about having a big house with a yard makes the whole complicated process feel worth it. I'm cleaning out the master bedroom closet 2 weeks after we move in, when my hand hits something solid in the back corner. I pull out a wooden box I recognize immediately, my mother's jewelry box that Ronald took during the divorce. My hands shake as I open it, finding most of the pieces still inside, my mother's pearl earrings and her silver bracelets and the rings she wore every day. The necklace Bethany took isn't there, but almost everything else survived. I sit on the closet floor and cry with relief that these physical connections to my mother and grandmother made it through Ronald's theft. Some things he took can be replaced with money from Francine's inheritance, the furniture, and books, and dishes. But these pieces of jewelry that my mother wore, that my grandmother gave her, that carry decades of family history, these are irreplaceable. I hold my mother's favorite bracelet, and remember her wearing it while she cooked dinner, while she drove me to the school, while she hugged me goodbye. Finding this box feels like recovering a piece of my history that I thought was lost forever. Ronald moves into a small apartment across town, and I know this because he texts me the address for custody exchanges. When I drop Zoe off the first time, I see the building is similar to the one I lived in after the divorce, small and basic with parking spaces instead of a yard. The role reversal isn't lost on either of us, and I can see him struggling to maintain his superior attitude while standing in front of a building that broadcasts his reduced circumstances. He tries to make comments about how Zoe will need to adjust to a smaller space at Daddy's house, but the forced humility shows in every word. When he picks Zoe up at my house the following week, he stands on the porch of my grandmother's home, and I watch his face while he takes in the obvious improvements I've made. His jaw tightens, and he rushes Zoe to his car without the usual lecture about my failures, and I realize he's finally understanding that his cruelty didn't just fail, it completely backfired in ways he never imagined possible. The first few weeks of shared custody go smoother than I expected, because Zoe bounces between houses with the kind of adaptability only kids seem to have. She decorates her room at my place with posters and stuffed animals, making the space entirely hers, and she talks about having 2 homes now instead of just visiting Mommy's apartment. One evening while we're making dinner together, she mentions that Daddy's new place is pretty small compared to my house. I can hear Ronald's voice in those words, the way he spent 2 years telling her that small spaces meant failure and big houses meant success. I stop chopping vegetables and look at her carefully, choosing my words with the same precision I used when helping Francine with her paperwork months ago. I tell her that houses don't measure what people are worth, that kindness and honesty matter more than square footage or fancy furniture. She nods, but I can see her processing this contradiction, trying to reconcile what I'm saying now with everything her father taught her about my apartment being proof of my inadequacy. I don't push it because undoing Ronald's damage will take time, but I'm planting different seeds now, showing her through actions that security comes from character, not possessions. I start seeing a therapist named Dr. King 3 weeks after moving back into my grandmother's house, because winning in practical terms doesn't erase what Ronald did to me. The first session feels awkward and exposing, sitting in her office trying to explain how my ex-husband spent 2 years secretly destroying my life while pretending to work on our marriage. She listens without judgment as I describe the manipulation, the theft, the custody arrangement designed to punish me, and then the strange guilt I feel about Francine's death, even though the will was her choice. Dr. King helps me understand that I can hold multiple truths at once, that I can genuinely grieve Francine while also feeling satisfied that justice was served through her final act. She points out that my motives for visiting Francine started calculated, but became authentic, and Francine was sharp enough to see both things clearly and make her own decision based on Ronald's lifetime of cruelty, not my 8 months of care. We work through the complicated emotions of being victimized by someone I trusted completely, of fighting back using methods that exist in ethical gray areas, of winning but still carrying damage from the battle. The therapy sessions become a space where I can admit that reclaiming my life doesn't mean I'm unscathed, that trauma leaves marks even when you survive it, that healing is slower and messier than revenge. I meet with financial advisors at their downtown office on a Tuesday morning, sitting across from 2 professionals who manage the trust fund Francine left for Zoe. The $4 million is invested conservatively in index funds and bonds, structured to provide steady growth without excessive risk, exactly what Francine wanted for her granddaughter's future. We review quarterly statements and discuss rebalancing strategies, and I ask detailed questions about expense ratios and tax implications, because I'm determined to honor Francine's trust by being a responsible steward of Zoe's inheritance. The advisors seem impressed by my engagement and preparation, probably expecting someone who just inherited millions to be careless or greedy. But I keep detailed records of every decision and meeting because Ronald will never stop believing this money should have been his. I know he's waiting for me to make mistakes, to mismanage the trust, to give him ammunition for another legal challenge that might actually succeed. So I'm careful and thorough and conservative, making choices based solely on Zoe's long-term interests, even when it means passing up opportunities for faster growth. The money will cover her college education completely, provide a down payment for her first home, give her financial security as she starts her adult life, all the things Francine wanted when she changed her will in that lawyer's office 8 months before she died. An invitation arrives in my mailbox on a Thursday afternoon, a handwritten note from a woman named Margaret Smith asking if I'd like to join their book club. Margaret was one of Francine's closest friends, someone who visited regularly during those 8 months I spent caring for Francine, and the invitation feels like an adoption into a social circle I never expected to access. I show up at Margaret's house the following Tuesday evening carrying a bottle of wine and having actually read the assigned book, nervous about fitting in with women who are mostly in their 70s and 80s. They welcome me warmly and immediately start sharing stories about Francine, how sharp her wit was, how she could see through people's nonsense with one glance, how she was always much smarter than Ronald gave her credit for. One woman named Dorothy mentions that Francine talked about changing her will months before she actually did it, that she'd been watching Ronald's behavior carefully and discussing her concerns with several friends. Another woman adds that Francine knew I started visiting with ulterior motives, but appreciated my honesty when I eventually admitted it during one of our conversations. They talk about Francine's clarity during her final months, how the dementia never affected her judgment about people, how she understood exactly what she was doing when she disinherited her son. I feel connected to Francine's memory in ways that have nothing to do with the inheritance, surrounded by women who knew her for decades and have chosen to include me in their circle because they witnessed the genuine care that developed between us. 6 months after moving back into my grandmother's house, I decide to host Thanksgiving dinner instead of spending it alone with Zoe. I invite my small circle of friends from work, people who supported me through the worst parts of the divorce, And I also invite Margaret and Dorothy and several other women from the book club who've become my friends. The house feels warm and alive again as I cook in my grandmother's kitchen using her old recipes, setting the table with the china Ronald took and I bought back, filling rooms that had been cold and hostile under his occupation. Zoe helps me make pie crust, getting flour everywhere and laughing when I tell her stories about learning to bake in this same kitchen when I was her age. The guests arrive bringing side dishes and wine, and soon the house is full of conversation and laughter. People who actually care about each other rather than what they can take. Margaret tells stories about my grandmother that I'd never heard, and Dorothy shares memories of Francine that make Zoe giggle. My work friends blend easily with the older women, and I watch this unlikely gathering with something close to contentment, realizing that I've built a community from the wreckage Ronald left behind. The house that was stolen and reclaimed now holds people who chose to be here, who showed up because they value connection, not possessions. I'm clearing dishes after dinner when my phone buzzes with an email notification, and I glance at the screen to see Ronald's name. I don't open it immediately, because I know whatever he's written will be designed to ruin my mood, but curiosity wins after the guests leave and Zoe is asleep upstairs. The email is long and bitter, claiming I've turned everyone against him, stolen his inheritance, taken his house, destroyed his life systematically and deliberately. He writes that I manipulated his dying mother, poisoned his relationship with his daughter, and now I'm living in luxury while he suffers in a tiny apartment. The victim narrative is so complete and self-deluding that I almost laugh, because Ronald genuinely cannot see that every consequence he's facing stems directly from his own choices. I start typing a response listing all the ways he destroyed our marriage and stole everything I owned, but I stop halfway through and delete it. Anything I say will just fuel his belief that he's the injured party, that I'm the villain in a story where he's actually the hero wronged by circumstance. I close the email without responding, because I'm learning that the best revenge isn't proving him wrong. It's living well and letting his own choices speak for themselves. He can send 1,000 emails painting himself as a victim, but the truth exists in court documents and witness statements, and his own documented cruelty, and nothing I say will change the narrative he's constructed to protect his ego. Zoe asks me a few days later why Daddy seems so sad all the time now, and I'm washing dishes when the question hits me. I turn off the water and dry my hands slowly, buying time to figure out how to answer honestly without poisoning her relationship with her father. She's sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, looking up at me with genuine concern for Ronald, despite everything he's done, and I'm reminded that she's 8 years old and loves both her parents regardless of their failures. I sit down across from her and tell her that sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't work out the way they hoped, that Daddy is learning some hard lessons about treating people with kindness and respect. I don't mention the theft or manipulation or cruelty because that's not her burden to carry, but I also don't lie and tell her everything is fine. She nods thoughtfully and goes back to her math homework, and I wonder how much she understands about the situation, how much Ronald tells her during his custody time, how much damage is being done that I can't prevent. I'm trying to model honesty and fairness even when it's hard, showing her that you can acknowledge someone's struggles without excusing their behavior, that compassion doesn't require forgetting what people have done. I reconnect with Sarah and Jennifer, friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage to Ronald, meeting them for coffee at a place downtown. We haven't spoken in almost 3 years because Ronald gradually isolated me from everyone who might question his control, and sitting across from them now feels both comfortable and strange. Sarah admits they'd seen warning signs about Ronald's behavior, the way he monitored my phone, the comments he made about my spending, the subtle ways he undermined my confidence in social situations. Jennifer adds that they didn't know how to bring it up without seeming jealous or judgmental, that they'd tried a few times but I defended him so completely they backed off. I understand now that abuse works partly because outsiders can't intervene without the victim's cooperation, that Ronald was skilled at making his control seem like concern and his manipulation seem like partnership. We rebuild these friendships slowly over weekly coffee dates and occasional dinners, and I'm learning to trust people again, despite everything Ronald did to make me doubt my own judgment. They're careful not to push too hard or ask too many questions, letting me share details at my own pace, and their patience helps me believe that not everyone has hidden agendas or ulterior motives. The 1-year anniversary of Francine's death arrives on a cold morning in November, and I take Zoe to the cemetery with fresh flowers. We stand at the grave reading the headstone, and I tell Zoe stories about her grandmother's sharp wit and fierce independence, keeping it age-appropriate but honest. Zoe places the flowers carefully and asks if Grandma is happy in heaven, and I tell her I think Grandma is at peace knowing she protected the people she loved. I silently thank Francine for her final act of clarity and protection, acknowledging to myself that my motives started calculated, but the relationship became real. Francine made her choice based on Ronald's lifetime of behavior, his 50 years of taking her for granted and treating her like an inconvenience, not just my 8 months of daily care. The guilt I feel about benefiting from her death exists alongside genuine grief for losing someone who became a friend and doctor. Dr. King has helped me understand that both feelings are valid. I can miss Francine while also being grateful for what her will provided, can mourn her loss while acknowledging the justice of her final decision. Zoe and I spend 20 minutes at the grave before the cold drives us back to the car, and I feel Francine's presence in the way her choice continues to reshape all our lives. I hear through the legal community that Barry has stopped speaking to Ronald after Ronald can't pay the legal fees from the failed will challenge. My lawyer Oswald mentions it casually during a meeting about finalizing the trust paperwork, noting that Barry apparently feels used and manipulated by Ronald's promises of payment once the inheritance came through. The irony of Ronald losing his closest ally through his own selfishness isn't lost on me, because Barry enabled every step of Ronald's divorce scheme and now faces his own consequences. I learned that Barry is under ethics investigation for his role in the secretly recorded therapy sessions and fabricated evidence, that several of Ronald's other victims have come forward with similar stories of manipulation. Ronald burned through his support network by treating everyone as tools to be used, and now he's alone in his small apartment with nobody left to blame but himself. The pattern is so clear from outside his delusion. How he destroys every relationship through his own selfishness. How he creates the very abandonment he claims to suffer from, unjustly. I feel a strange mixture of satisfaction and weariness watching Ronald's world shrink to match the smallness of his character, knowing that justice sometimes arrives slowly, but arrives nonetheless. I get called into my boss's office on a Tuesday afternoon, and my first thought is that something went wrong, because good news doesn't usually come with that serious expression he's wearing. He sits me down and starts talking about my performance over the past year, how I've handled everything professionally despite what he knows has been a rough time personally. Then he tells me they're creating a new senior position, and he wants me to take it, with a 15% salary increase and better benefits. I sit there processing this for a moment because the inheritance money means I don't desperately need this raise, but I accept immediately because I want my own career and my own accomplishments that have nothing to do with Francine's will or Ronald's schemes. Walking back to my desk, I feel this weird mix of pride and relief, knowing that I built this through my own work and reliability, not through anyone's death or manipulation. The next week, I attend parent-teacher conferences at Zoe's school, and her teacher pulls out this folder of recent work, all marked with good grades and positive comments. She tells me that Zoe's performance has improved dramatically over the past few months, that she seems more confident and relaxed in class, more willing to participate, and less withdrawn during group activities. The teacher mentions that she's noticed Zoe talking about having her own room at both houses now and how much happier she seems with the new custody arrangement. I sit there looking at Zoe's improved test scores and carefully written homework assignments, and this matters more to me than any amount of money because it means I'm actually undoing the damage Ronald caused. Zoe is learning that stability exists, that her mother can provide a real home, that she doesn't have to choose sides or feel guilty about being happy with me. That evening, I'm sorting through paperwork at my desk when someone from the accounting department stops by to drop off some files, and we end up talking for 20 minutes about a project we're both working on. His name is Kian, and he's been with the company for 3 years, and there's something easy about the conversation that makes me realize I haven't had a normal interaction with a man in years without analyzing every word for hidden manipulation. Over the next few weeks, we run into each other at meetings and in the break room, and eventually he asks if I want to grab coffee sometime. I say yes, but make it clear I'm taking things very slowly. That trust doesn't come easily after what I went through with my divorce. Kian nods and says he understands, that he's been through a rough breakup himself and knows that rebuilding takes time. Our first actual date is just coffee and conversation, nothing fancy. And what strikes me most is how he listens when I talk and asks questions about my opinions, rather than telling me what I should think. He treats me like an equal, like someone whose thoughts and feelings matter. And I'm relearning what healthy interaction feels like after years of Ronald's control. We see each other once a week for the next month, keeping things casual, and I don't introduce him to Zoe because I'm not making that mistake again. Then Ronald somehow finds out I'm dating, probably through one of the mutual acquaintances who still talk to both of us, and my phone explodes with angry messages. He's texting about how I'm moving on so quickly and disrespecting our marriage, conveniently forgetting that he filed for divorce 2 years ago after planning it for 2 years before that, while sleeping with Bethany. The messages get increasingly unhinged, accusing me of replacing him and corrupting Zoe's understanding of family values. I read through them once, screenshot everything for my records, and then block his number except for the co-parenting app Oswald helped me set up where all communication is documented and focused solely on Zoe's needs. Ronald tries the app next, sending messages about my dating life, and I respond once telling him that my personal life is not his concern and all future messages must be about Zoe's schedule, school, or medical needs. When he continues with personal attacks, I stop responding entirely, letting his words sit there unanswered in the app, where they just make him look unstable and obsessive. The house renovations I've been slowly working through are finally reaching the main living areas, erasing the last traces of Ronald's presence from the space. I'm painting walls in colors I actually like instead of the beige neutrals Ronald insisted on, hanging artwork that reflects my taste rather than his need for everything to look expensive and impressive. Zoe helps me pick paint colors for her room, debating between different shades of purple before settling on one she calls Galaxy Violet. I watch her excitement as she makes these choices, how seriously she takes the decision, and I realize I'm teaching her that she has agency over her own space and life. We spend a Saturday afternoon painting her room together, getting more paint on ourselves than the walls, and she tells me this is the most fun she's had in forever. The room slowly transforms into something that's completely hers, with space for her books and art supplies and a reading corner by the window. I set up a separate college fund for Zoe using my own salary, contributing $300 every month from my paycheck. The inheritance trust from Francine is secure and growing, but I want Zoe to know that her security comes from multiple sources, that her mother is capable of providing through my own work and planning. I meet with a financial advisor to set up the account properly, making sure it's structured for education expenses, and I keep the paperwork in a folder where Zoe will eventually be able to see exactly how I've been preparing for her future. This fund won't be as large as Francine's trust, but it represents something different, something I built through my own effort, rather than someone else's final act of justice. Ronald's social media presence becomes increasingly desperate as more people learn the full story of how he orchestrated the divorce. Someone posts a detailed account in a local community group about the therapy notes he secretly recorded and the purchases he made in my name, and suddenly people who only knew his version are seeing the complete picture. His attempts to paint himself as the victim lose credibility when neighbors and Francine's friends start commenting with their own observations about his behavior. I watch his friend count drop steadily, his posts getting fewer likes and comments, his social circle shrinking to people who don't know the history or don't care about what he did. Even some of his own family members stop interacting with his posts, maintaining polite distance from someone whose cruelty has become public knowledge. The letter arrives on a Wednesday in an official court envelope, and I almost throw it away, thinking it's another legal notice about something routine. Instead, it's from Judge Altair, who handled our original divorce case, which is highly unusual because judges don't typically reach out to people whose cases they've decided. He writes that he's learned information suggesting the case was decided based on fabricated evidence, that he's been made aware of the secretly recorded therapy sessions and the purchases made in my name without my knowledge. The judge is careful to say he can't reverse the original ruling because legal processes don't work that way, but he wants me to know that he recognizes an injustice occurred. The letter ends with information that he's referred Barry to the State Bar for ethics review based on what he's learned about the evidence fabrication. I read the letter 3 times, feeling this weird validation from someone who has no reason to reach out, except genuine concern about justice. 2 weeks later, I'm contacted by an investigator from the State Bar Ethics Committee who wants to interview me about Barry's role in Ronald's divorce scheme. I meet with her in a conference room downtown and spend 3 hours going through everything. The therapy notes Ronald recorded without my knowledge or consent, the purchases he made in my name to make me look financially irresponsible, the photos he took when I had the flu to make me look like an unfit mother. I provide copies of bank statements showing the purchases I never made, phone records proving I never agreed to the therapy recordings, medical records from when I had the flu during the time period of those damaging photos. The investigator takes detailed notes and tells me that several other people have come forward with similar stories about Barry helping clients fabricate evidence in divorce cases. I don't know what consequences Barry will face, but I know that Ronald's network of enablers is finally being held accountable for the damage they've caused. That evening, Zoe is doing homework at the kitchen table, and she looks up suddenly and tells me she's glad she gets to spend equal time with both parents now, but she feels safer and happier at my house. I stop what I'm doing and sit down across from her, asking if everything is okay at her dad's place, making sure she knows she can tell me if something is wrong. She says nothing bad is happening, just that Dad's apartment is small and he seems angry a lot, and at my house she has her own room and I'm not mad all the time. I don't press for more details because I don't want to encourage her to badmouth her father, but I understand what she's really saying. Children recognize authenticity and stability even when they can't fully explain it. They sense the difference between a parent who's present and engaged versus one who's bitter and resentful about circumstances he created himself. I tell Zoe I love her and I'm glad she feels safe here. And we go back to homework and dinner prep like it's just another normal evening, which is exactly what it should be. 3 weeks after the ethics committee interview, I get a call from someone named Alice who runs a divorce support group that meets at the community center downtown. She explains that she heard about my case through the legal community and thinks my story could help others who feel powerless in their own divorce situations. I'm hesitant at first because talking about everything still feels raw and complicated, but Alice says I don't have to share anything I'm not comfortable with. Just whatever might help people understand they have options even when everything seems lost. The meeting is on a Thursday evening in a room with folding chairs arranged in a circle, and there are about 15 people there ranging from their 20s to their 60s, all looking tired and scared in ways I recognize from my own reflection 2 years ago. Alice introduces me, and I stand up, feeling my hands shake a little. Then I start talking about Ronald serving me at my mother's funeral and losing everything, including my inherited house and primary custody of Zoe. I explain how I documented everything, kept copies of bank statements and emails, tracked every cruel comment and financial manipulation even when it felt pointless because I'd already lost in court. I tell them about visiting Francine and how it started as strategy, but became genuine care, and how she made her own choice to change her will based on Ronald's lifetime of behavior, not my 8 months of companionship. I'm honest about the moral gray areas, about starting the relationship with Francine for calculated reasons, about the satisfaction I felt watching Ronald lose everything he'd stolen from me. I tell them that real life isn't simple good versus evil, that sometimes you do questionable things to survive and protect your child, and you have to live with the complexity of your own choices. Several people ask questions about how I found good legal help and what documentation proved most useful, and I share everything I learned about protecting yourself when your spouse is planning to destroy you. A woman in her 30s starts crying and says her husband is doing exactly what Ronald did, secretly recording therapy and making purchases in her name, and I give her Oswald's contact information along with advice about starting her own documentation immediately. After the meeting ends, 5 different people come up to thank me for being honest about the darkness and the complicated ethics instead of pretending everything was straightforward, and I realize that sharing the messy truth helps more than sanitized success stories ever could. I see Ronald at a coffee shop 2 months later, waiting in line to order, and I almost don't recognize him at first because he looks so much older than the last time I saw him up close. His hair is grayer and thinner, his face has new lines around his mouth and eyes, and he's wearing clothes that look cheaper than what he used to buy. He's alone, no Bethany, no confident swagger, just a middle-aged man who looks tired and beaten down by circumstances he created himself. I'm with a friend from work, and we're laughing about something when Ronald turns and sees me, and I watch his face go through several emotions before settling on something like resignation. He doesn't approach me, and I don't approach him. We just look at each other for a moment across the coffee shop, and I feel this strange absence of anger that surprises me. Part of me still feels satisfaction seeing him reduced to this smaller version of himself, living in a cheap apartment and working a regular job without the millions he thought would fund his early retirement. But the larger part just feels tired of carrying anger around like extra weight, tired of monitoring his destruction and measuring his suffering against mine. My friend notices me staring and asks if I'm okay, and I tell her that's my ex-husband, and she wants to know if we should leave. But I say no, because I have every right to be here, and I'm not letting him take up any more space in my life than absolutely necessary. Ronald gets his coffee and leaves quickly, and I stay with my friend and we go back to laughing about work gossip and weekend plans. That evening, I'm folding laundry in my grandmother's house, and I realize I spent maybe 5 minutes total thinking about Ronald today, compared to the months after the divorce when he occupied every thought and every moment of rage. I'm ready to focus on building my own life instead of watching his fall apart, ready to invest my energy in Zoe's happiness and my own future, rather than Ronald's consequences. The financial advisor calls to schedule our quarterly meeting about Zoe's trust fund, and when I arrive at his office downtown, he's got charts and reports spread across the conference table showing how the investments have grown over the past year. The trust has crossed the $5 million mark through conservative investments and compound interest, which means Francine's original $4 million has grown by 25% while sitting safely protected from Ronald's attempts to access it. I review every transaction and investment choice carefully because I take my role as trustee seriously, keeping detailed records and making sure every decision aligns with Francine's stated intentions to provide for Zoe's future. The advisor suggests some slightly more aggressive investments that could yield higher returns, but I stick with the conservative approach because this money isn't for gambling. It's for ensuring my daughter has security and options when she's old enough to use it wisely. I ask questions about tax implications and long-term growth projections, making notes in my trustee journal where I document every meeting and decision. The advisor comments that I'm one of his most diligent clients, that most people in my position would be tempted to use the money for personal expenses or make risky investments. But I explain that this is Zoe's inheritance from her grandmother, who trusted me to protect it. I'm not going to betray that trust by treating this money as anything other than what it is, a gift from Francine to her granddaughter that I'm honored to safeguard until Zoe is old enough to manage it herself. We spend 2 hours going through everything, and I leave the office feeling confident that the investments are sound and aligned with Francine's wishes. That evening, I update my trustee records with notes from the meeting, filing everything carefully in the organized system I've maintained since taking over the trust. Ronald has no idea how much the trust has grown or how carefully I'm managing it. And he never will because he gave up any right to that information when he spent 2 years stealing everything from me and our daughter. Spring arrives and I buy seeds and gardening tools, finally starting the vegetable garden I'd always wanted to plant in my grandmother's backyard before Ronald took the house away. Zoe helps me mark out the garden plot, and we spend a Saturday afternoon turning soil and pulling weeds, her hands getting dirty as she laughs and asks questions about what each plant will grow into. We plant tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers, along with sunflowers that Zoe insists on adding because she likes how tall they grow. I show her how to make rows and space the seeds properly, how to water without drowning the plants, how to watch for the first green shoots that mean something is growing underneath the soil. She's careful and focused, taking the work seriously in that way children do when they're being trusted with something important. We plant marigolds around the edges because I remember my grandmother saying, they keep pests away, and Zoe wants to know if Grandma planted vegetables here too. I tell her yes, that this garden is continuing something Grandma started, that we're growing things in the same soil where Grandma grew her own food. Zoe asks if we can share the vegetables with Daddy when they're ready, and I tell her of course, because the garden isn't about keeping things from Ronald, it's about creating something good and watching it grow. Over the next weeks, we water the garden every evening, and Zoe gets excited when the first tomato plant breaks through the soil. She runs inside to tell me, and we go look at the tiny green shoot together. And I think about how growing things feels like rebuilding what was destroyed. How patient care and attention can create something new from dirt. The garden becomes our project, something we check on together during her weeks with me, and watching things grow from seeds we planted together feels more valuable than any amount of money sitting in a trust fund. Ronald files another legal challenge 6 months after the first one failed, this time claiming I coerced Francine through emotional manipulation and elder abuse. His new lawyer is someone I don't recognize, probably the only attorney desperate enough to take a case this obviously without merit after Barry's ethics investigation made Ronald toxic in the legal community. Oswald receives the filing and calls me laughing, explaining that this challenge is even weaker than the first one because all the evidence of Francine's mental competency and clear reasoning still exists. We respond with a motion to dismiss and include all the documentation from Mio's competency evaluations, the medical records showing Francine's cognitive function, and the video recordings of her clearly explaining her reasoning for disinheriting Ronald. 2 weeks later, Ronald's new lawyer withdraws from the case, filing paperwork that basically says he reviewed the evidence and realized there's no legitimate legal basis for the challenge. The judge schedules a hearing, and I don't even need to attend because Oswald handles it, but he calls me afterward to report that the judge sanctioned Ronald for filing frivolous motions. The judge warned Ronald in open court that any further baseless challenges will result in more serious consequences, including potential contempt charges and additional financial penalties. Oswald says Ronald looked panicked when the judge was speaking, finally understanding that the legal system won't let him keep harassing me just because he's angry about losing his inheritance. The sanctions include paying my legal fees again, another $10,000 that Ronald definitely doesn't have, and the judge's warning is now part of the court record that will follow any future attempts to challenge the will. I feel relieved that this is finally over, that Ronald has exhausted his legal options and been told by a judge to stop wasting everyone's time with his vindictive lawsuits. That evening, I tell Zoe that some grown-up legal stuff is finally finished, keeping it vague because she doesn't need details about her father's continued attempts to take her inheritance. She asks if everything is okay, and I tell her yes, that sometimes adults have to go to court to sort out disagreements, but now everything is settled, and we can just focus on normal life. I take Zoe to the beach for a week during summer vacation, using money I've saved from my salary instead of touching the trust fund, because I want her to understand that her mother can provide good experiences through my own work and planning. We stay in a modest hotel right on the water, and Zoe is so excited she barely sleeps the first night. We spend days building sandcastles and swimming in the waves, collecting shells and getting sunburned, despite multiple applications of sunscreen. Zoe makes friends with other kids on the beach, and I watch her play without the anxiety and tension she carried for so long after the divorce. One evening, we're sitting on the beach watching the sunset and eating ice cream, and Zoe tells me this is the happiest she's been in a long time. I ask her what makes her happy, and she says, being here with me, not worrying about anything, just having fun together. She says at Daddy's apartment he seems stressed all the time and talks about money problems, but with me she feels like she can just be a kid. I tell her I'm glad she feels happy and safe, that making sure she has good experiences and feels loved is the most important thing to me. We sit quietly for a while watching the waves, and I think about how this simple beach vacation means more than any amount of money in a trust fund, how these memories of building sandcastles and eating ice cream at sunset are what childhood should be made of. The next day we go mini golfing, and Zoe beats me by 3 strokes, celebrating her victory by doing a silly dance that makes me laugh so hard I can't breathe. We take pictures together, selfies with the ocean in the background, and Zoe's smile is genuine and bright without any of the forced quality it had in those awful months after Ronald got primary custody. On our last day, we collect 1 more bag of shells, and Zoe says she wants to come back here next year. And I promise we will, because this is now our tradition, our special place where we can just be together without any complications or adult problems intruding. I'm having coffee with one of Francine's friends from her book club, a woman named Margaret who's become a genuine friend over the past year. She tells me stories about Francine that I never heard before, including how Francine started seriously considering changing her will after watching Ronald drop Zoe off at my apartment one day. Margaret says Francine called her that evening horrified by what she'd witnessed, how Ronald had made cruel comments about my reduced circumstances right in front of Zoe, how he'd sneered at my small apartment, and told Zoe to remember that this is what happens when you're not smart with money. Francine apparently told Margaret that she couldn't believe her son had become someone so deliberately cruel, that watching him treat the mother of his child with such calculated meanness made her physically ill. Margaret says Francine talked about it for weeks, how she'd raised Ronald to be better than that, how disappointed she was that he'd turned into someone who would steal from his wife and use his daughter as a weapon. Another friend of Francine's joins us and shares that Francine told her the will change wasn't about me specifically, it was about refusing to reward Ronald's cruelty, and ensuring Zoe would be protected from her father's financial manipulation. They both say Francine was completely clear-headed when she made the decision, that she understood exactly what she was doing and felt at peace knowing she was protecting her granddaughter from Ronald's selfishness. I listened to these stories feeling this complicated mix of validation and sadness, understanding that Francine saw Ronald's true character through his treatment of me, and Zoe, that she made her choice based on 50 years of knowing her son, not just my 8 months of companionship. Margaret says Francine talked about me with genuine affection, that she appreciated having someone who cared about her comfort and dignity, rather than just waiting for her to die so they could inherit. I thank them for sharing these stories because they help me understand that Francine's decision was more complex than I'd realized, that she was making her own strategic assessment of Ronald's character, just like I was making mine. I'm driving home from work one afternoon thinking about everything that's happened over the past 2 years, and I suddenly understand something that changes how I see the whole situation with Francine. I started visiting her with ulterior motives, that's undeniably true. I was angry and looking for any advantage I could find against Ronald. But Francine was also making her own strategic assessment during those 8 months, watching how I treated her versus how Ronald had treated her for 50 years, observing how Ronald treated me and Zoe when he thought his mother wasn't paying attention. We were both operating with mixed motives, both using the relationship for our own purposes. But the genuine care that developed between us was real, even if it grew from complicated soil. Francine wasn't a helpless victim of my manipulation. She was a sharp woman making clear-eyed choices about who deserved her trust and her money based on demonstrated behavior over time. She saw Ronald's cruelty and my kindness, his neglect and my attention, his selfishness and my care, and she made a decision that protected her granddaughter while punishing her son's lifetime of taking her for granted. I wasn't the only one being strategic. Francine was playing her own game and she played it brilliantly, using her will as a final statement about character and consequences. This realization doesn't absolve me of starting the relationship with calculated motives, but it does help me understand that Francine had agency in all of this, that she made informed choices based on her own assessment of everyone involved. The relationship was transactional at first, but became genuine. And that transformation from strategy to authentic care is what makes the whole situation so morally complicated. I wasn't a hero rescuing a helpless old woman, and I wasn't a villain manipulating a confused victim. I was someone who started with selfish motives and developed real affection, while Francine was someone who accepted help while making her own judgments about who deserved her final gift. 2 years after Francine's death, I'm sitting at Zoe's parent-teacher conference listening to her teacher describe how well she's doing academically and socially. Zoe has straight A's, strong friendships, good participation in class activities, and what the teacher calls a stable emotional foundation that helps her handle normal childhood challenges without falling apart. The teacher mentions that earlier in the year, Zoe seemed anxious and withdrawn. But over the past several months, she's blossomed into a confident, happy child who feels secure enough to take risks and try new things. I know the change corresponds with the custody modification and the financial stability that let me move into a proper house where Zoe has her own room and space to feel at home. The teacher asks if there have been any major changes at home, and I explain briefly about the custody arrangement improving, and she nods, understanding that family stability directly impacts school performance. That evening, Zoe is doing homework at the kitchen table in my grandmother's house, the house I inherited and lost and bought back, and I'm making dinner while helping her with math problems. She's working on fractions and getting frustrated, but she keeps trying instead of giving up like she used to when things got difficult. I think about how the inheritance remains untouched in its trust fund, except for conservative investments that have grown it to over $5 million, all of it waiting safely for Zoe's future while I support our daily life through my own income and careful budgeting. Ronald has no access to any of it, no knowledge of how it's grown, no ability to manipulate or steal what Francine left for her granddaughter. Zoe finishes her homework and asks if we can work in the garden before dinner, and we go outside together to check on the tomatoes that are finally turning red. She's excited about picking them soon and making salad, about eating vegetables we grew ourselves in Grandma's garden. I watch her carefully examining each plant and think about how she's thriving now with equal custody, appropriate housing, and the emotional security of knowing both parents love her even if we can't be together. The inheritance provided the foundation for this stability, but the daily work of parenting and loving her is what actually makes the difference in her life. The email arrives on what would have been our anniversary, and I almost delete it without reading, because I've trained myself to ignore most of Ronald's attempts at communication outside the co-parenting app. But something makes me open it. Maybe curiosity about what manipulation he's attempting now, and instead of anger or accusations, it's just 3 sentences. He writes that he's been thinking about the past and realizes he destroyed everything good in his life through his own choices, that he lost a wife who loved him, and a mother who would have supported him if he'd treated people with basic decency, that he has no one to blame but himself for ending up alone and diminished. There's no request for forgiveness, no plea for money, no manipulation, just a brief acknowledgement of cause and effect. I read it twice trying to find the angle or the trap, but it seems like genuine recognition of consequences, like Ronald finally understands that his calculated cruelty cost him everything he actually valued. I don't respond because I don't owe him forgiveness or closure, because his moment of clarity doesn't erase 2 years of abuse and manipulation, because my healing doesn't require me to absolve him of what he did. But I feel something shift inside me when I close the email, a release of the last threads of connection to who we used to be, a final letting go of the marriage that died long before he served me at my mother's funeral. Ronald's acknowledgement doesn't change anything practical. Zoe still has equal custody, and the trust fund remains protected, and I still live in my grandmother's house that I bought back from him. But emotionally, it feels like the last piece of the old story finally ending. Like I can close that chapter completely and focus entirely on the new life I've built from the ashes of what he destroyed. I delete the email and go back to making dinner. And when Zoe gets home from Ronald's place, I ask about her week and listen to her stories about school and friends, and I don't mention the email because it's not her burden to carry her father's belated regrets. I'm sitting in my grandmother's house, the house I inherited and lost and bought back, watching Zoe do homework at the kitchen table where my grandmother used to roll out pie dough every Sunday. Zoe's bent over her math worksheet, tongue poking out slightly the way it does. When she's concentrating hard and the afternoon light coming through the window hits her hair the same way it used to hit mine when I was her age doing homework in this exact spot. The circle isn't perfectly closed because life isn't that neat, but it's closed enough that I can breathe freely and sleep peacefully, and trust that my daughter's future is secure. Ronald has no access to any of it, no knowledge of how it's grown, no ability to manipulate or steal what Francine left for her granddaughter. Zoe finishes her homework and asks if we can work in the garden before dinner, and we go outside together to check on the tomatoes that are finally turning red. She's excited about picking them soon and making salad, about eating vegetables we grew ourselves in Grandma's garden. I watch her carefully examining each plant and think about how she's thriving now with equal custody, appropriate housing, and the emotional security of knowing both parents love her, even if we can't be together. The inheritance provided the foundation for this stability, but the daily work of parenting and loving her is what actually makes the difference in her life. 6 months after settling back into the house, I introduced Zoe to someone I've been seeing for the past few months. His name is Kian, and we met at work where he treats everyone with the same steady respect, regardless of their position or what they can do for him. I've taken things carefully and slowly, because I'm not repeating the mistake of moving too fast or letting someone into our lives who hasn't earned that trust. Kian arrives on a Saturday afternoon with a board game he mentioned Zoe might like. Nothing expensive or showy, just thoughtful. Zoe is cautious but friendly, staying close to me on the couch while Kian sets up the game on the coffee table. She asks him questions about his job and his dog and whether he likes pizza with pineapple, testing him in the way kids do when they're figuring out if someone is safe. Kian answers honestly, doesn't try too hard, doesn't push for affection or approval. When Zoe beats him at the board game, he congratulates her genuinely instead of letting her win on purpose, and I watch her relax slightly as she realizes he's treating her like a real person. After he leaves, Zoe tells me he seems nice and asks if he's going to come over again. I tell her maybe sometimes if she's comfortable with that, and she nods and goes back to her room. I'm teaching her through example that healthy relationships are built on respect and honesty, not control and manipulation, that people earn their place in our lives through consistent behavior over time. Oswald calls me on a Tuesday morning to say the final legal paperwork confirming my sole trusteeship of Zoe's inheritance is ready to file. I drive to his office downtown and sign the documents that will transfer control to Zoe herself when she turns 25, giving her access to everything Francine left, plus the growth from careful investing over the years. Oswald explains the provisions one more time, how the trust is structured to provide for Zoe's education and major life expenses while preserving the principal, how there are protections against anyone trying to manipulate or pressure her into accessing the money early. He hands me a sealed envelope that Francine left with Mio all those years ago, with strict instructions that it be given to Zoe on her 25th birthday. I hold the envelope carefully, feeling the weight of Francine's final message to her granddaughter, knowing it will explain everything when Zoe is old enough to understand the full story. Francine's will includes a letter to be given to Zoe on that birthday, explaining her grandmother's reasoning and love, ensuring that Zoe will understand why things happened the way they did, and how much Francine wanted to protect her from Ronald's selfishness. I put the envelope in my safe deposit box along with other important documents, another piece of Francine's legacy waiting for the right moment. The paperwork is filed that afternoon and I feel something settle inside me, knowing that no matter what happens to me, Zoe's future is legally protected and clearly documented. I'm driving home from the grocery store on a random Thursday when I pass Ronald's apartment complex and see him loading bags from his car. He's aged noticeably in the 3 years since Francine's death, hair grayer and posture more stooped, wearing clothes that look worn and slightly too big. I feel nothing but mild pity for someone who had everything and threw it away for the illusion of control, someone who could have had a partner and a mother and financial security, but chose manipulation and cruelty instead. I don't slow down or acknowledge him, just continue driving toward home where Zoe is waiting for me to help with her science project about plant growth. The moment passes without significance because Ronald doesn't occupy space in my thoughts anymore, except as a cautionary tale about what happens when you treat people as objects to control rather than humans to respect. His life is smaller now, and that's the natural consequence of his choices, not something I need to celebrate or dwell on. I get home and help Zoe measure her bean plants and record the data in her notebook, focusing on the life I'm building, rather than the one Ronald destroyed. 3 years after Francine's death, I'm financially stable through my own career after accepting that promotion and building a reputation for reliable quality work. I'm living in my reclaimed family home where Zoe has her own room decorated the way she wants it and a backyard where we grow vegetables together. I'm sharing equal custody of a thriving daughter who gets good grades and has friends and seems genuinely happy most of the time. I'm building a healthy relationship with Kian, who treats me as an equal partner, who asks my opinion and respects my boundaries and shares household decisions, instead of making them unilaterally. The inheritance sits safely invested for Zoe's future, growing steadily through conservative choices and professional management, completely separate from our daily lives. Francine's final act of justice provided the foundation for rebuilding what Ronald tried to destroy, gave me the resources to fight back and reclaim what was rightfully mine and Zoe's. But the actual rebuilding happened through 2 years of daily work, of showing up for custody exchanges with dignity, of being present for Zoe's school events, of proving through consistent action that I was the stable parent, despite what Ronald's lawyers claimed in court. The money mattered, but the character mattered more, and I built this life through both Francine's gift and my own determination to be better than what Ronald tried to make me. I'm planting flowers on Francine's grave with Zoe, who's now 10, and asking thoughtful questions about her grandmother's life and choices. She wants to know why Grandma Francine left her the money instead of Daddy, and I tell her the truth in age-appropriate ways about how Grandma Francine was a woman who believed in protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves and rewarding genuine care over blood obligation. I explain that sometimes family isn't just about who you're related to, but about who shows up and treats you with love and respect. Zoe nods seriously and places the flowers carefully around the headstone, purple petunias that were Francine's favorite. She asks if Grandma knew how much the money would help us, and I tell her yes, that Grandma was very smart and wanted to make sure Zoe would always be safe and have opportunities. Life isn't perfectly fair, and I carry complicated guilt about the circumstances that led to this outcome, about starting those visits with ulterior motives, even though the care became genuine. But Zoe is secure with equal custody and a trust fund that will pay for college and help her start adult life without debt. I'm stable with a career and a home and a relationship built on mutual respect instead of control. And Ronald faces the natural consequences of his own cruelty, living in a small apartment and working a job he hates because he destroyed every good thing in his life chasing power over other people. It's more justice than many people ever receive, and I'm learning to accept that imperfect justice is still better than none at all.